come after Igor because I'm also talking about as a policy topic. But this is slightly from a different angle because I'm talking about institutions, and so it's a bit more about the grassroots growth of open education practices and policy within with the institutional level. And I was reflecting earlier when we were discussing, or we're hearing from our hosts here at Hahn, how great it is to be in an institution that embraces and fosters open education. And it kind of made, and we also had some comments about sometimes you're the only person in the institution that research is open or does something open. And I was thinking that's really where I started this research, was thinking about that, about those people, the open educators that are kind of going it alone and not necessarily with all that much kind of institutional support behind them. And that was where I started to think, well, what is institutional support, and what would it look like, and is it out there? And so some of the key concepts in this study really are about valuing, whether institutions value openness, and I decided to look at that through the question of whether they actually put policy, and in a broad sense policy support more generally than just a kind of a written policy in place in order to enable OEP to happen. So in terms of my research questions, I was asking my kind of big overarching question: to what extent and in what ways do higher education institutions value OEP? And I had some sub-questions which were, and to what extent are institutions fostering OEP through forms of policy or other support? And what are the key drivers of institutional policy support for OEP, according particularly to open educators? So it was really all about asking the open educators about their views. And then because this research was in many ways taking place during and interrupted by the global pandemic that we had not that long ago, although now it's starting to feel like, oh, a while ago. Then I kind of added an additional research question about to what extent were these policy drivers or trends altered or accelerated in the context of the pandemic. I know I have a drink actually. And so how did I do this? I did a survey of open educators. Some of you in this room answered the survey. Thank you once again. Some of you noted that it was very long. It was very long. And with this, the idea behind this was what's sometimes referred to as purposeful sampling of a relevant kind of expert or interest group. So in other words, I specifically wanted to hear from open educators, not necessarily like when you do a political opinion poll and you just want to know what do people in general think about this topic. I wanted to know what did this group of people think about this topic, because these are the kind of really are going to understand what it is and what's going on with it as far as they're concerned. And there was really a wide range of, so this was a completely open call, like please respond to my survey. There was a wide range of countries that were represented in the responses. But of course, I was calling for responses in English. I was putting it out through all kind of my networks, mailing lists, social media, conferences that I was presenting at. That was a big factor because I got a huge response from Canada. So because I presented in Canada. And so I ended up really with, I guess, a lot of kind of Anglosphere countries responding and global North as well. But still there was quite another range, a big range, but just smaller response numbers from other countries. And there's about 39 countries, I think, in total. And so in the survey, I used a combination of closed and open-ended questions. I had a lot of essentially free text response questions. And so it yielded some numbers and also a lot of words, really a lot. Because there were in the end 201 responses. So the survey, in a sense, was almost like an interview, except that people had to complete it, online. But then I did actual interviews with a specific group of people who I would describe as open educator policymakers, in the sense that they would identify themselves as they're also open educators, but they also have a role in kind of creating or implementing institutional policies that relate to open education. One moment for a sip. And then in order to analyze all this data, I did reflexive thematic analysis, sort of based on the Brown and Clark approach. And I'll explain a little bit about what I discovered through that in a minute. But first, I thought I'll tell you a little bit about the survey, about the sort of kind of quantity. I've never pretended that I know how to do quantitative research, but there were some numbers that were found, so I'm going to tell you about them. So I did kind of like these Likert scale questions where I asked people to rate the level of policy support that they perceive in their own institution for a range of practice areas. So I selected some different practice areas, which I'll show you in a second in the slides. And then we're rating them across 5 dimensions of policy support. So one was kind of actual explicit policy, and there was funding. There's kind of funding available for different kinds of projects or initiatives. Is there relevant infrastructure available for people to do open practices with? Are there staff available that have relevant expertise in the institution was another one. So in other words, people that you can actually go to and say, I want to do this thing, but I don't really know how to do it, but I know what it is. And then that person go, I know what you need to do. You know, that I sort of often have had that role of being that person. So I was like, this is a useful person. This might be a factor. So that I include that as well. And also, whether it's possible for people to gain any kind of recognition or reward for their practice. So the kind of key kind of practice area that I looked at, or one of the practice areas, because they were all significant, was of course OER. And I obviously can't really talk through the detail of these graphs very much, but you will note that there was, down at this end, we have people who say that this was kind of unsupported in their institution. Down at that end, it's, apart from the very end, it's highly supported, but then at the very end, not sure. And you can see there's quite a wide range for OER. Quite a lot of people are saying it's unsupported, but there's a lot of people in each kind of layer all the way up to highly supported. So that was sort of like, okay, it wasn't that bad, but they did note, you know, you can see the biggest kind of result was for recognition of OER practices. Whether there's any reward and recognition available for it was in the unsupported, like just there is not. And then I also asked about MOOCs and other kinds of free or open or low cost kind of courses. So I was also asking people, I did next sort of explanation about what I meant by each category so that people would sort of know what, that I was thinking a bit more broadly than MOOCs. So I tend to think about micro-credentials, for example, as something that's evolved from MOOCs. And so I was also asking about micro-credentials as well. And here, that really a stronger emphasis in the unsupported compared with OER. In quite a lot of institutions, not really much support happening for them. And in the free text responses, when people discuss this, they tended to talk about how if you're doing MOOCs, then you would need to work with the kind of specialists in various kinds of aspects of it, like learning designers, kind of video production people, and that kind of thing. So that seemed to be the sense that people had, was this was not something that any institution just does. It was like you would kind of need to be set up for it, was kind of the impression that people were giving. I had a category that I called open learning practices, and I kind of described what I'm talking about there, and that's kind of the open pedagogy, open learning design. It's the including students as kind of co-creators of knowledge, and in various different kinds of ways. And again, more unsupported than supported, but there was some, some strengths in the upper levels. The staff expertise was often through these categories looked slightly better than in some of the other dimensions of policy or support. Wiki practices, here I was thinking particularly about things like editing or creating Wikipedia articles, but also maybe working with Wikidata. As you can see, highly unsupported. And there were people who said, no, people think Wikipedia is misinformation and things like this, in the free text responses. They're quite a sort of surprising after so many years that we've had Wikipedia and had people kind of doing all kinds of projects around students working with it, that for a lot of people it's still like, oh, you can't trust what's on there because anybody can edit it and this kind of thing, was still like not an uncommon view. I also thought that open communities, the kind of fostering, running, and participating in them was a relevant area for a relevant practice area that I wanted to ask people about. And slightly different because it tends to be more, I guess, more self-organized, often something that cuts across institutional boundaries. But I thought, well, let's see what people tell me about it. Again, kind of very unsupported and very, for all of these, very much the recognition for doing these practices, people were saying, was really not much there, not often there. Finally, I also included open science and scholarship as a kind of a, like, I'm not sure if everyone would necessarily call this a form of OEP, or if they'd regard it as an adjacent category. But I wanted to include it because I wanted to see, well, what does it look like compared to my practice areas that I've already covered? And here we had really, it was looking a lot healthier in terms of the spread of the amount of support that's available across the different dimensions. Still quite bad for recognition, which actually even I thought was surprising. But so that is not even all the quantitative questions. There were plenty of other ones, and I'm not going to go into them. I'm just going to talk about the thematic analysis from the survey free text, which was the overall big picture. So I had many free text questions, and I did a kind of a short analysis of the responses of each one. But then I did a kind of big overview of what are the big themes emerging out of the survey. And what open educators really, in general, were I think getting across as a group, as a collective, was that they felt it was really important that the value and legitimacy of open practices should be recognized. That they felt it was under-recognized. They were concerned about the sustainability of open practices in their institution. They noted tensions between institutional and educator priorities. And usually, in the case of the people who responded to the survey, that was sort of saying, we think that the institutional leadership don't get this, or not interested in it, or not it. The importance of staff with relevant expertise was highlighted again and again, and particular areas like the library or kind of teaching and learning centers were often mentioned as this is what the people that we rely on, learning technologists and designers as well. The need to broaden the institutional policy concepts of openness was quite big. So in other words, to think about not just about open science, not of open education necessarily as only about OER, but to think about a bigger ecosystem of open practices. And the need for recognition and reward came through just as strongly as it did in the kind of more quantitative version of the responses. It was discussed again and again in the survey responses as well. I'll tell you a little bit about the interviews, and then Becca's going to tell me to stop. So in terms of the interviews, what I did was I took the same themes that I'd gained from the survey responses, and I kind of used them as lenses to analyze the interviews. And the interviews were very much broadly aligned in their views, and they were able to add that kind of policy angle on what were they doing to try and ameliorate some of these issues that were raised by the survey. I'll just go a bit faster. OSS, Open Science and Scholarship, generally was understood as quite strongly supported compared with more strictly educational things. OER was the most prominent practice area. In terms of North American context, it was strongly associated with textbooks and with reducing student costs. But everyone in North America and the other kind of respondents in my interviews saw it as a way to improve diversity of sources and enhance learning. Other practice areas were seen as desired, but as more tricky to make policy about. The tensions theme, in terms of tensions between institutional and educator priorities, was really interesting in terms of the interviews, because there people were talking more about actually how sometimes it was the tension between the open educators and the colleagues in the institution that didn't necessarily see the value of open education more so than senior managers. And I suppose this is because these were people that were actually in a position where they were trying to make policy around it, and they were then finding that sometimes it was the colleagues that were trying to block it. And I wanted to read you just this quote that I found really interesting, where one of my interviewees said, using an open consultation process around open education policy was helpful to diffuse some of that tension, because it's quite difficult for people to speak out and say it's a bad idea that students should save money or that educators should have pedagogical flexibility. Even though I know I don't have to do it, I think none of my colleagues should be permitted to engage in it, right? So that was really interesting to me, because sometimes I think when I propose, like, we should all be co-creating our institutional policies and blah, 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 you imagine it in a more Pollyanna-ish way, perhaps, than this. But I thought that's co-creation actually as it really is. So really, I wanted to leave you with that, but I'll leave you with some of my key points on the slide while we have questions, and you can just read those.
Okay.